So we want to pick up where we left off in our discussion about prayer as ministry. It's pretty profound and pretty important. In part one, we established that prayer is ministry to God. It's not merely going to God to ask for help, and it's not going and getting your petitions heard, right? Prayer, and that's how we want to think about it, is prayer is service to God. Prayer is the opportunity to enter into the presence of God, and we do that to offer service. So prayer is where a heart that's rightly formed and rightly oriented and rightly trusting and rightly aligned before Him enters and ministers before Him. As we turn to Matthew 5 and 6, this is where actually Jesus explains what ministry is. And we'll actually let Jesus teach us about prayer and how to pray and how to minister to God, because that's what this is all about. And He does that in the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 5, 6, 7, it's all one continuous long sermon. And most of the time when we come in and we come to Matthew 6, we go straight to the Lord's Prayer. And we are right to do that. It's central. It's important. But there's something important about those chapters that I think we sometimes might miss. And the teaching about the prayer before Jesus actually gets to the Lord's Prayer, what it's telling us is that the Lord's Prayer really is not a detached model. It's not something just dropped into the middle of the sermon. Matthew 6, Jesus gives a concise distillation of the very themes He's been developing throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount. It's the posture of the Beatitudes. Remember that word. We talked about it in part 1. It's the posture, the right orientation. It's followed by the application of those Beatitudes, and He's putting them in action. And it shows how they're used and how they glorify God. And then you get into the deeper righteousness, the kind of righteousness that surpassed the Pharisees, the call to reconciliation, the warning against misdirected devotion. And we're going to get into that. And the whole idea of devotion or ministry and service, it's the ministry of giving, it's the ministry of prayer and the ministry of fasting. And then it's wrapped up with the command to trust God. And all of that converges on the Lord's Prayer. So the idea is this, is that Jesus doesn't begin the sermon with prayer. He wraps the lesson up with it. And that's the key, is that all the work that's done before prayer is what Jesus is doing to teach us how to stand before God in ministry. And He's teaching us about that posture and about that ministry. So hopefully you start to see how that connects back to part 1. So what Jesus does is in Matthew 5, He forms the heart. Right? And then He corrects devotion and reorders the treasure in Matthew 6. And then He says, pray like this. So the idea then is that prayer is not where you start. It's not what creates the ministry. It's what expresses it. It's the doorway through which the formed life is brought before God. It's the ascent. And we ascend in through Christ. So prayer, it's a natural progression. It's the next step. It's the culmination of the formation. So just like Jesus shows us and He teaches it, that it leads into the prayer. Because prayer is ministry to God. And there's a fitness that's a preparation that's required for prayer and in the same way that it's required for ministry. So what is ministry? I think that's important to make sure we define that as well, right? Because that is the natural question that comes up. So ministry, really simply, it's service rendered to God for His glory. It's living under God's rule in a way that His character becomes visible through us. It includes what's done before Him in prayer and what's done for Him in the world through us. So ministry is not just actions. It's the life that our life shows, that flows from a heart that's aligned with God and results in His glorification. It's a life that's oriented towards Him. Ministry then is obedience, it's devotion, it's action offered to God from a heart that belongs to Him. That's really what ministry is. So let's take it to what Jesus specifically says ministry is. And he starts that in chapter 5 with the Beatitudes. He said, these are the things that glorify God. It's the seasoning in the world. So, and that's really important because maybe you don't ever see it that way. Maybe you don't ever think about it that way. But these things are the things that glorify God. Your seasoning, it talks about the salt and how the salt, what the salt would do if it loses its seasoning, right? But the idea then is that you should be salt, seasoning the world. And he talks about you being a light that shines in the world. But you're letting your light shine. You're a city on a hill. You're abiding in secret, is that you're praying there and that you're giving there and you're fasting there. All of it connects back to this idea that you trust God and you trust in God to provide, and that you trust that God's going to see, instead of trusting in wealth or in your own actions, right? So that's ultimately where the teaching gets us to. So it's a correction on making sure that you pray the right way. So they're not different or separate categories of spirituality. They're the visible expressions of a life that's governed by God. That's what it is. And that's the element of ministry to him. Not the root, but the thing under the surface. That's why Jesus gets to it. And he goes directly to the heart and the intentions, right? So what it is the heart. It's posture. It's the person who's bringing these offerings of ministry. They're the fruits of abiding. The root, ultimately, is alignment with God. If you are aligned with God, then you are going to produce the fruit. The root is a deeper underneath thing, like a heart, and the visible expression is the fruit. So Jesus deals with the root first before the fruit can be expressed, because the fruit produces, and it's the glory to God. So ministry is that fruit. And that's the pattern you see all throughout Jesus' teachings. So this is the pattern in Matthew 5 and 6. Is that, again, Matthew 5 forms the heart. Matthew 6 exposes devotion and reveals the treasure. And where your treasure is where you trust. So trust then determines whether your ministry remains pure. So the teaching then says that ministry to God is not public activity. It's not visible spirituality, or it's not performance. It is a rightly formed heart, a rightly ordered loyalty, a rightly directed trust, a rightly aligned will. And we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about alignment next time. But it's also the rightly cleansed devotion. So all this is service to God, and is service in prayer. It's service to God in the world, and service directed to God. And it's flowing from a life that seeks his glory. And that's ministry. So let's talk then, and let's see how Jesus actually built that definition. Because again, remember, Jesus is teaching us how to pray. The formation comes before the prayer, but Jesus is teaching us how to pray, and that's what this is all about. So chapter 5 describes that person who ministers to God, and he begins with the Beatitudes. So he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the pure in heart, and blessed are the peacemakers." So here's the key, and think about it. This is what describes the posture. This is the posture before God that's being described. Those who have a poor in spirit, they depend on God. Those who mourn, they're sensitive to the sin. The meek, they submit to the strength of God's rule. Those who hunger for righteousness desire what God desires. The pure in heart live with undivided interior loyalty. Peacemakers reflect God's very character in the world. So ministry begins with this kind of heart. It's formed, and it begins with dependence, humility, and inward alignment. That is a rightly formed heart. And that's the internal formation that we're getting at. Or in terms of what we said in part 1, this is posture. Because ministry doesn't begin at the altar, and it doesn't begin with that prayer. It begins with a rightly ordered heart. And from here, Jesus shows how a right-formed person actually lives. And that's where he goes when he starts to go a little bit deeper. So he makes that standard really explicit, is that unless your righteousness surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And that statement truly does define ministry, is that righteousness must go deeper than the visible audience. It must reach into our inner life, our inner core, our inner being. So this is where he starts to talk about it. He says, you don't murder because there's no hatred in your heart. There's no adultery because there's no lust in your heart. There's no false oath because there's integrity in your heart. There's no retaliation because mercy governs your life. And then he says that there's even love for the enemies. So that's not an external compliance. You're not trying to do this because you have to. You're doing this because your desires are transformed, because your heart's been transformed. So the ministry is integrity flowing outward from that inner alignment with God. And it's all governed from the inside out. So then Jesus begins to conclude this section. When he starts to do it, he says, therefore you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And again, we talked about this a little bit before in part 1, but we're not talking about flawless performance. We're not talking about flawless obedience. We're not talking about being perfect, right? He's calling specifically for wholehearted likeness. He's calling for undivided loyalty and trust. Then he's calling for the heart that reflects the same character as himself. And that's the key, is that ministry requires that kind of internal righteousness. And so we're talking about righteousness here. We're not talking about perfection. The righteousness that Jesus is talking about is talking about right standing and right orientation before God. So think about it this way. In the Psalms and in Proverbs too, you see this image or this conversation about the righteous. The righteous they're not sinless people. What the righteous are the people that belong to the Lord. They're the ones that have entered into a covenant with him. They seek him, they trust him, they walk in his ways, they love what he loves. The righteous then are the people that love God and they come to God. So this is an important concept, because what this means is righteousness is being made right before God. It doesn't mean you're living a perfect life. It doesn't mean you're meeting the perfect standard. You're not meeting it perfectly. You have right status because God made you that way. He made you to have that right status before him. When God brings a person into covenant with himself, he covers them. His righteousness becomes their standing before him. Again, we talked about it in part 1, that you don't have the ability to meet God's righteous standard alone, but you have to receive it from Christ, right? So that standing is given to you, and that standing flows from transformed desire, a transformed heart, right? So it's not perfection, it's participation. And when we talk about alignment is participation. And ministry back to God flows from that kind of righteousness. So when Jesus says something really, really important after here, it's massive. It directly connects to the heart of worship. He says, if you're offering your gift at the altar and then you remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled with your brother and then come and offer your offering. So this is speaking to the integrity of your relationship. It's directly connected to the fitness for ministry before God. You can't minister to God harboring the unreconciled sin. You cannot separate devotion from integrity at the heart. So before your offering, before your service, before you approach God, you must be reconciled. There must be forgiveness. And afterwards, then you come. So it's not a small instruction. It's significant. It's massive. It basically tells us that ministry to God requires a cleansed and reconciled heart. The point is, ministry, again, this is what it's all about, is the heart. Ministry begins in the inner life. It begins in the heart. So it's formed in righteousness, guarded in relationship, and brought before God in prayer. And this is the preparation that happens. So then after you have that formed heart, chapter 6 then begins to make a little more sense. That devotion begins to appear from that formation. And this is the same message. He's carrying it over. So it's what Jesus is doing. He's protecting that formed heart. So think about it that way, that he created something, he formed something, and now he's trying to protect it as it moves into the world. So chapter 5 is the forming of that heart. And then chapter 6 is the protections against it. So it's performative devotion. That's really what we're getting at. Then we said that the devotions are the giving, the praying, the fasting. And here's the thing. He assumes that we're going to do all three. He says, when you give, when you pray, when you fast, these are all acts of devotion. They actually can become misaligned and misdirected. So in that sense, that's what he's trying to correct. And in each case, the problem is the same. It's the audience and it's the reward. Each of those follows the same pattern. There's an act of devotion. It's giving, it's praying, it's fasting. They're done to be seen. They're done to be admired or noticed. In each case, Jesus says they will have their reward, or they already received their reward, which means the issue is not devotion. It's not the audience. It's the reward. Because what's really happening is the identity is being secured by that man. They're securing it horizontally. They're doing something. It's their actions that are giving them their trust. And the problem is that that's in contrast with what God tells them to do. They should be first seeking God. And your trust should be directed upward towards God and trusting that God's going to provide instead of trusting in yourself. So then the devotion becomes a way to be affirmed by the people and to gain leverage from God. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But the giving example helps us to see this inverse absolutely clearly. The need to be seen, that in of itself is not really sin. We were made to be known. We were made to be affirmed. We were made to be recognized. That longing in and of itself, it's good. But the misalignment happens when the identity is secured by our actions towards people. The giving becomes a means of self-boasting. They weren't giving to lift the burdens of somebody else. And that's ultimately what giving should be. They were relieving their insecurity. They performed, that performance in of itself created some kind of comparison. It created pressure and a hierarchy. It created pride in themselves. What happened is when that giver created pride in themselves, they simultaneously created shame in the observer. So then instead of, I see your need and I will act and give, it actually becomes, see my generosity, see how good I am. And in that, love collapses. It nullifies and exposes the true motivation of the person. The focus then moves from one in need to the one giving. And it becomes self-boasting and self-gratification rather than sacrificial love, which is what Jesus taught all along. So what appears to be mercy, it really becomes self-display. And what we should do to relieve a burden becomes a means of self-affirmation. And Jesus said they received their reward on earth. The same thing was true with fasting. And before we get into prayer, we'll just pick up the idea of the fasting first. So here's the key with fasting, is that fasting, what it does is it exposes what we believe will satisfy us. It's not just about restraint. And that's why it's connected to prayer. You always see this prayer and fasting. It's about hunger and releasing you from the things you're hungry for. And anything that you're hungry for that's not God, it gets exposed. So fasting then tells God, you are my hunger. It's about loving God in your relationship. It's about dependence on God for provision. And it doesn't need an audience to do it. Because fasting changes what satisfies us. And if we have our satisfaction from God's provision and God's presence, then we're put into the right place. And fasting helps reveal where we are not in the right place. It helps reveal what our real treasure is by forcing us to figure out what we actually believe that we can't live without. And whatever that is, that's where your treasure is. And that's ultimately what Jesus is saying here. So then let's turn to prayer. Jesus, he exposes two distortions that appear in the prayer. There's the performance before people, and then there's the manipulation to God, or trying to manipulate God. The hypocrite, he performs for approval. The Gentile, he performs for control. The repetition and the length is what Jesus corrects. He's not saying it's wrong to repeat words twice, or even repeating. It's about believing that if you say the right thing, if you say it long enough, or if you say it often enough, or you just say it in the right way, or use the right word, that God will respond. He says they think they'll be heard for their many words. That's the error. The Gentile error is believing his words are the lever that he can pull and make God act. It's when that act of service and devotion can be used to produce an outcome with God. And Jesus strikes that down. He says that your Father knows what you need before you ask him. And what it means is you can't inform God. You can't persuade God. And you certainly cannot control God. So the problem there, it's fully exposed. The temptation is to aim your devotion at people for approval or aimed at God for control. And in both cases, the issue is not the devotion. It's what you're after. It's what you trust to provide it for you. And then after Jesus talks about the devotion, then he talks about where your treasure is and there your heart will be also. That verse, it actually governs everything that comes next, because the devotion reveals the real treasure. If your treasure is reputation, your reward will be recognition. If your treasure is security, your reward will be control. Treasure shapes your heart, and your heart shapes everything about your behavior. It shapes what you value, what you seek, and everything flows from what you treasure. And whatever you treasure will quietly begin to direct how you give, how you pray, and how you fast. And that's how it's all connected. And then, moreover, it affects what you worry about. If you don't trust God, then you're going to worry and try to do it yourself. Jesus is saying here that you can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve the two issues. Because the issue is truly whatever it is you love, whatever it is you treasure, whatever it is you trust, that's what controls you. And that's what controls your heart. What controls your heart is what controls your outward behavior. And that's why you must trust God to provide for you. And the Bible consistently teaches that throughout. Ultimately, it boils down to treasure shapes your heart. Then the heart shapes your devotion. So again, devotion is your ministry. So your heart is shaped, and your heart controls your devotion. Your heart controls your ministry. So that's why when Jesus is talking, Jesus is always talking about your heart. So then, as the example show, giving, it becomes self-pleasing, and the prayer becomes leverage, and then the fasting is just theater. That's really what it boiled down to in the teaching. And then the worry becomes inevitable, because where your treasure is, that's what you're going to be trying to protect if you don't trust that God's going to give it to you. So instead of your treasure protecting you or providing for you as God promised to do, you're trying to do it yourself. But if your treasure is God, your ministry is love, and it's love inside that relationship, and you enjoy his presence, and you enjoy his provision, and you enjoy his friendship. So that's how devotion moves inward. It moves to the trusting, to the hidden, and to the aligned. And that's what Jesus is teaching there in Matthew 6. So that's why Jesus is saying, seek first the kingdom, because when your treasure is rightly placed, everything else will follow after. And then Jesus says, don't be anxious, because that's really the diagnostic. If you, whatever we actually trust, anxiety reveals the treasure. And if you fear losing it, then you don't trust God to provide it. So that's why Jesus says your Father knows what you need before you ask him. You're not telling him something he doesn't know, and you don't need to inform you. And he sees us, he sees everything, and he sees into the hidden places. So you don't need to have the visibility. You don't need to pull a lever. You don't need other people to see it. You don't need it. And then this is where everything starts coming together. Ministry is not something you do only in prayer. And ministry is a life that's lived. It's a heart that's rightly oriented, and it's oriented all day in love and in forgiveness and trust and quiet obedience. And then that life is brought into relationship, and it's brought into relationship through prayer. So when you come to God, you're not coming to construct some great prayer to be heard, but you're doing it just to be with him. And that's why the Lord's Prayer is so simple and in the way it is. It's because it's not really about the words you're saying. It's about you going to be with him. It's about you going and entering into that relationship. And so that's what the real focus should be. And again, that's why you can go sit quietly and not say a word and just listen. And then when he speaks, you respond. Because really what you're doing there is you're going to find your friend. David was called a friend of God. What it must have meant is that David just showed up to listen to God. That David must have just gone just to be with God. That David went and played his harp, played it just to be with God. Because when everything is aligned, there isn't much of anything else that needs to be said. And that's what he's saying, that God already knows it. God already has it. So you don't need to say anything else. So prayer is not where ministry begins. It's the door where the life of ministry is entered into, and then where it's expressed. So that's why Jesus, after all that's been said and done, that's why Jesus finally teaches us how to pray. And again, it's not technique, and it's not performance, it's not leverage. He just says this, pray like this then, our Father. And that's our identity. He's our Abba, he's our God. Hallowed be your name. It's the reverence. Your kingdom come, and that's the alignment. That's where we're about to go next. Your will be done. You submit to what he says. Give us this day our daily bread. That's the dependence on God, and a recognition that we rely on him for our provision. Then he talks about the cleansing, and we talked about why cleansing is important, is that forgive us our sins and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's the life of formation and the life that continues after it's been formed. So the prayer, it is ministry, and it's ministry in structured form. And honestly, again, like I said, this is what's going to prepare us for this next section, which is the alignment and the answered prayer section.